The city glittered that night. Street lights reflected off shiny black cars gliding past the cobblestone streets, and in the heart of the town's elite district stood La Maison d'Or, a restaurant whispered about in magazines and adored by critics. Gold chandeliers dangled like crowns from the ceiling. Velvet seats were polished so smooth they looked untouched, and the faint aroma of five-star dishes drifted through the air like an invisible promise of perfection. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with quiet sophistication. Business moguls, celebrities, and politicians sat at round tables, their laughter polite, their wines vintage. Every detail, every flicker of a candle, every clink of fine china spoke of prestige. And then the doors opened. Taylor Swift stepped in. Not in a glittering gown or paparazzi-ready outfit. Tonight she had chosen simplicity. A white blouse, slightly wrinkled from travel, and dark jeans paired with classic flats. Her blonde hair was loosely tied back, framing her face in soft waves. To anyone who looked beyond appearances, she was elegance personified, calm, understated, and glowing in her own effortless way. But to one pair of eyes, appearances were everything. A young waiter, barely in his 20s, noticed her immediately. His uniform was spotless, his posture stiff with pride. This was not just a job to him, it was a performance, and he considered himself guardian of the restaurant's exclusivity. The sight of Taylor, dressed so plainly, instantly rubbed him the wrong way. He didn't recognize her, or maybe he didn't care. What mattered to him was the judgment he had already passed. His lips pressed into a thin line as he strode toward her. The room didn't notice yet. The diners were too absorbed in their meals and conversations, but that was about to change. Taylor walked gracefully to the hostess stand, ready to request a table. Before she could even speak, the waiter cut in, his tone sharp, his frown disapproving. "Ma'am, this is a luxury restaurant." The words hung in the air, heavy with condescension. Taylor paused, slightly tilting her head. "We don't usually serve people dressed like this," the waiter continued, his eyes scanning her blouse and jeans as though they were a crime, and he leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to add sting. "Are you sure you can afford it?" For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The faint clinking of silverware stopped. Glasses of wine hovered mid-air. One by one, diners turned their heads. A hush fell across the room, the kind that makes your skin prickle. Even the pianist at the corner faltered, his fingers hovering over the keys as silence swallowed the melody. Taylor stood still, her hands gently folded in front of her. Her expression was unreadable, calm in the storm of judgment. No anger, no flinch, just a quiet stillness that commanded attention more powerfully than any outburst ever could. But the waiter, however, mistook her silence for hesitation. Emboldened, he straightened his tie and added, "This establishment caters to a certain standard. If you're looking for something casual, there are plenty of diners down the street." Gasps rippled through the restaurant. A woman at a nearby table whispered, "Is he serious?" A man in a tailored suit shook his head, murmuring, "He has no idea who he's talking to." And indeed he didn't. Taylor Swift, one of the most celebrated artists in the world, a woman who could have easily bought not just a meal but perhaps the entire establishment, was being dismissed as if she were an imposter in a palace. But instead of lashing out or storming away, Taylor simply pulled out a chair at the nearest empty table. She sat down, gracefully smoothing the wrinkles in her blouse, her eyes steady on the waiter. The silence deepened. Every diner in the room leaned forward slightly, eager to witness what would unfold. The waiter flushed, torn between irritation and uncertainty. Should he call security? Should he insist she leave? Yet something in Taylor's composure made him hesitate. Her presence, calm yet commanding, unsettled him. At that moment, the restaurant felt less like a glamorous dining hall and more like a stage. Every patron had become part of the audience, every glance trained on the quiet woman and the arrogant waiter. Taylor finally spoke, her voice soft but clear, carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "Is this how you welcome all your guests?" The question was gentle, but it struck like lightning. The waiter opened his mouth, then closed it, fumbling for words. He hadn't expected her to challenge him, not like this, not with such poise. Diners exchanged glances. Some approvingly nodded at Taylor's grace, others shook their heads in disbelief at the waiter's arrogance. And the young man stammered, I just meant, we have a dress code. It's—" But his words trailed off, weaker by the second. The weight of disapproving stares from the other patrons bore down on him. And Taylor? She didn't move. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to unravel his confidence. And so, in the midst of golden chandeliers and velvet seats, the stage was set. An unassuming woman, dressed simply, had become the center of attention, not by force, but by the quiet strength of dignity. Nobody knew what would happen next. Would she reveal who she was? Would the manager intervene? Would the arrogant waiter double down? One thing was certain. The night was no longer about fine dining. It was about respect, judgment, and the lesson that appearances can deceive. The entire room held its breath. Taylor sat calmly, her eyes steady, her face unreadable. And everyone knew they were about to witness something unforgettable.
The silence in the restaurant should have been enough to warn him. The stares from every direction, the gasps of disapproval, the whispers of recognition. Anyone else would have stepped back, swallowed their pride, and offered an apology. But arrogance is a strange thing. It blinds, it hardens, it convinces people they are right, even when the world around them tells them otherwise. The young waiter straightened his posture, chin lifted, as if doubling down on his judgment would protect him from the uncomfortable spotlight he had cast upon himself. His lips curled in disdain, and then, just loud enough for those around him to hear, he muttered with a sneer, "This place is for real celebrities and wealthy people. You might be in the wrong place." The words sliced through the quiet like a knife. A woman at the next table gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. The man seated beside her leaned forward, his voice urgent but hushed. "Isn't that Taylor Swift?" Another diner, a young woman in an elegant black gown, turned to her date with wide eyes. "Of course it's her. I saw her in a magazine just last week. What is he doing?" The whispers began to ripple through the room like a wave, quiet at first, then growing into a buzz of disbelief. People exchanged glances, some horrified, some amused, others simply curious about how far the waiter would take his reckless behavior. But the waiter, he ignored them. Or perhaps he heard, but pride refused to let him reconsider. He saw only what he wanted to see, a plainly dressed woman who in his eyes didn't belong. But Taylor remained calm. Her posture was steady, her gaze soft. She didn't return insult for insult, nor did she try to defend herself. Instead, she folded her hands neatly on the table and spoke in a voice so even, so composed, that it seemed to hush even the whispers around her. "I'd like a glass of water, please." Simple, direct, no anger, no argument. The request caught the waiter off guard. For a split second, he faltered, his smug expression cracking into something uncertain. But then he scoffed, as though trying to recover his ground. Without a word, he spun on his heel and disappeared toward the bar. The diners exhaled, as if they had been holding their breath. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others glanced at Taylor with admiration, impressed by her composure. Yet the tension did not fade. It only thickened, like storm clouds gathering before a downpour. Moments later, the waiter returned with a tall glass of water. But his arrogance hadn't cooled. If anything, it had festered. With deliberate carelessness, he set the glass down with a thud that echoed louder than it should have. Water sloshed over the rim, droplets splattering across the pristine white tablecloth. A few stray drops landed on Taylor's blouse. Gasps erupted again. "That's outrageous," whispered a man in a tailored navy suit, his face red with anger on Taylor's behalf. "Unbelievable! He actually slammed down," muttered another diner, shaking his head. A couple across the room looked visibly embarrassed, as though the waiter's behavior shamed them personally for being part of the same establishment. The pianist at the corner had stopped pretending to play altogether. His hands rested awkwardly on the keys, his eyes darting nervously toward the scene. Taylor glanced down at the spilled water. Her blouse was slightly damp now, the tablecloth stained with scattered droplets. Yet her expression did not change. She did not scold, she did not demand an apology. She simply reached for the glass, lifted it with both hands, and took a slow sip. The act was so ordinary, so graceful, that it seemed almost unreal against the backdrop of hostility. In that single gesture, Taylor conveyed more dignity than 1,000 words could have managed. The room was captivated. Every diner, every server, every staff member had become part of the silent audience to this unfolding drama. Some leaned forward in their seats, eager to see the explosion that surely must come. Others looked away, unable to bear the second-hand embarrassment of watching a man dig himself deeper into disgrace. But Taylor, she simply set the glass back down, carefully, gently, without spilling a single drop. Her calmness only highlighted the waiter's rudeness. Every contrast, every action made his arrogance more glaring. He had slammed the glass. She had lifted it with grace. He had spoken with disdain. She had replied with quiet dignity. He had turned the restaurant into a stage for humiliation, and yet she had transformed it into a lesson in patience. The tension in the air grew heavier, almost unbearable. Some guests whispered to their companions, their voices trembling with excitement. "She's handling this better than anyone else could. It's incredible. She's not even upset." "She doesn't need to be. He's burying himself." Still, no one dared to intervene. Not the other servers, not the hostess, not even the manager, who had begun to hover nervously at the edge of the dining hall, unsure whether to step in or wait. All eyes remained fixed on Taylor, and the waiter, emboldened once again by her silence, stood tall with a smug smirk, as if he believed he had won some invisible battle. But the truth was clear to everyone else. He hadn't won anything. He was unraveling thread by thread, while Taylor remained untouchable. The entire restaurant had become a pressure cooker of anticipation. Every passing second tightened the suspense. Every whispered guess added more fuel to the fire. The question burned in everyone's mind. How long would she endure this treatment? When would she finally reveal who she was? Taylor sat calmly, her hands resting lightly on the table, her face still unreadable. And the room knew this was only the beginning.
The water glass gleamed in the golden light of the chandeliers. Taylor lifted it delicately, as though the careless slam hadn't mattered at all, and took a slow sip. Every eye in the room followed the movement, their collective silence as heavy as the velvet drapes lining the walls.
When she set the glass back on the table, her fingers lingered on its rim. Only then did she lift her gaze and speak, her voice calm, steady, but with an undertone that carried through the stillness like a bell tolling in the night. "You know," she began, her eyes meeting the waiter's with quiet intensity, "kindness is free, but arrogance can cost you everything." The words struck the room like a bolt of lightning. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The statement hung there, sharp yet graceful, impossible to ignore. Diners exchanged startled glances, some nodding ever so slightly, as though she had spoken the very truth they'd been thinking but hadn't dared to voice aloud. The waiter froze. A flicker of unease passed through his expression, but pride is a stubborn mask. He chuckled nervously, trying to brush it off as if her words had no weight. "I'm just doing my job," he said smugly, his tone dripping with false confidence. He folded his arms across his chest, puffing himself up, still convinced he held the authority. "We have standards here." Some guests winced at his words. A man in a sharp tuxedo muttered under his breath, "He's digging his own grave." A woman near the bar whispered, "He doesn't realize he's standing on quicksand." Taylor didn't flinch. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not mocking, not cruel, but patient, the kind of smile that said she saw through him completely. "Yes," she replied softly, "standards do matter." She let the words linger for a moment, the calm cadence of her voice filling the air with quiet strength. Then, leaning back slightly in her chair, she added with deliberate care, "Which is why I chose this place very carefully. I happen to like it here." The phrasing was subtle, but it landed like a mystery. The room shifted now. Diners exchanged puzzled looks. "Chose this place?" Someone whispered. "What does she mean by that?" Another diner frowned, murmuring, "That didn't sound like she meant just for dinner." The tension rose again, thick and suffocating. Every person in the room could feel there was a deeper meaning in her words, but none dared to speak it aloud. The waiter, however, was too blinded by arrogance to notice. He scoffed, shaking his head dismissively. "Well, you could have chosen somewhere else," he said, smirking. "Plenty of places might be more fitting for you." A ripple of discomfort moved through the restaurant. Several guests grimaced openly now. One elderly woman in pearls whispered to her husband, "She's giving him a chance to stop, and he doesn't even see it." Taylor didn't flinch. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. Not mocking, not cruel, but patient. She placed her hands gently on the table, her posture elegant yet unyielding. When she spoke again, her words carried a subtle weight, the kind of authority that didn't need to be shouted to be obeyed. "You see," she continued, her eyes locked onto the waiter's, calm but piercing. The air seemed to thicken, the chandeliers flickering faintly, as though even the light was leaning in to hear her words. The waiter opened his mouth, then closed it, fumbling for a retort. His smugness faltered, replaced with a nervous twitch at the corner of his lips. Still, pride kept him upright, his arms crossed defensively. I know how to do my job," he muttered, weaker this time, but still clinging to his arrogance. Taylor tilted her head, her expression of quiet compassion, as though she almost pitied him. "I'm sure you do," she said evenly. "But sometimes the way we do our job becomes the story people remember, long after they forget the food or the decor." The diners were transfixed. The truth of her words rippled through the room, undeniable. Many nodded, subtly, in agreement, their admiration for her composure growing with every sentence. The waiter, however, stood frozen, caught between defiance and doubt. He still hadn't grasped the deeper implication of her earlier statement, that she hadn't simply chosen to dine here. She had chosen the place itself. The whispers grew louder now, threading through the room like a current. Why did she say it like that? She doesn't just mean she picked it off a list of restaurants. Wait, does she mean what I think she means? The realization was beginning to dawn on them. The way she had said, "I chose this place," wasn't casual. It wasn't the language of a guest. It was the language of someone with a deeper connection, someone with ownership, with influence, with power. And yet, Taylor sat there in her simple blouse and jeans, as calm as ever, letting the suspense build. The waiter shifted uneasily now, sensing the weight of the stairs pressing down on him from all sides. His smugness was cracking. But before he could recover, Taylor's faint smile widened just a fraction, and she added one final line, her tone soft but unshakable. "I don't choose lightly." The room froze once more. The meaning in her words lingered in the air like a thundercloud about to break. The diners leaned forward in anticipation, their curiosity ignited, their respect for her composure deepening with every moment. The waiter, however, swallowed hard, suddenly unsure. His smugness, once a shield, now felt more like a trap he had built around himself. And still, Taylor waited, patient, composed, her calm response shaping the night into something unforgettable.
The room was on edge, suspended in that strange space between silence and anticipation. Taylor sat poised, her calm composure holding the room in an invisible grip. The waiter stood before her, puffed up with false confidence, still convinced he had maintained control. And then, footsteps. Fast, hurried, echoing across the polished floor. The double doors leading to the back swung open, and the restaurant manager appeared. His usually polished demeanor was replaced with alarm, his eyes scanning the room urgently before locking onto Taylor. The moment his gaze landed on her, his face drained of color. "Miss Swift," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with both shock and respect. He hurried forward, bowing slightly as he reached her table. We weren't expecting you tonight. Welcome back." The words rang out like a thunderclap. The entire restaurant seemed to inhale at once. Forks clattered against plates, glasses paused midair, and chairs creaked as diners turned in unison to stare at the woman who had been sitting quietly, enduring insult after insult with grace. Taylor Swift. Not just a guest, not just a celebrity, but someone who had just been addressed with reverence by the manager himself. The waiter froze, his smug posture crumbling in an instant. His eyes darted from Taylor to the manager and back again, confusion and panic colliding on his face. His voice cracked as he stammered, "What? You know her?" The manager spun toward him, disbelief flashing across his face. "Of course I do," he snapped, his tone sharp with reprimand. "How could you not? She's not just a guest here." He paused, glancing around the room as if to make sure everyone understood the gravity of what he was about to say. Then, with absolute clarity, he declared, "She's the owner of this restaurant." Gasps erupted like fireworks. The shock was immediate and electric. Diners dropped their silverware. A woman at the corner table covered her mouth with both hands. The young couple near the bar leaned forward in disbelief, eyes wide as though they were watching history unfold before them. "The owner?" someone whispered loudly. "Taylor Swift owns this place?" Another voice echoed in awe. The revelation rippled through the restaurant, shifting the atmosphere entirely. Where there was judgment and doubt, now there was admiration. No, reverence. Guests straightened in their chairs, suddenly self-conscious in the presence of the woman who not only graced the world's stages, but also commanded this very establishment. The waiter's mouth fell open. His earlier smirk, the one dripping with arrogance and superiority, evaporated completely. His skin flushed red, his body rigid as though he had been struck by lightning. He staggered back half a step, his knees wobbling, his hands twitching at his sides, as though unsure what to do. He had dismissed her. He had insulted her. He had mocked her clothes, her presence, even her right to sit at the table. And now the truth stood before him, undeniable, devastating. Taylor Swift wasn't just a customer, she wasn't just a celebrity, but the woman who signed the checks, who decided the standards, who owned the golden chandeliers and velvet seats he had been so eager to guard. And she had watched him fail spectacularly. Taylor, however, did not move. She remained seated, her hands folded neatly on the table, her calm expression unshaken. She didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to speak. Her silence alone was more powerful than any outburst could have been. The manager, pale and visibly shaken, bowed again. "Miss Swift, please forgive this unforgivable behavior. It will be dealt with immediately. If we had known you were coming tonight, the staff would have—" Taylor lifted a hand gently, silencing him without a word. Her eyes never left the waiter. The room held its breath. The weight of her silence was immense. It wasn't the silence of passivity, but of power, the kind of power that forced everyone else to confront their own behavior. The diners shifted uneasily, suddenly aware of how quickly judgment could backfire. The waiter, meanwhile, seemed to shrink where he stood, the full reality crashing down on him. He had mocked the owner of the very place he worked in. The arrogance that once inflated him now deflated like air from a balloon, leaving only fear and humiliation in its place. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his face a portrait of dread. Around the room, whispers turned to awe. "I can't believe it. She owns this restaurant? No wonder she said she chose this place. It makes sense now. All of it makes sense." The revelation was no longer just about Taylor's identity. It was a lesson to everyone present. Judgments based on appearance, arrogance built on assumptions. It could all unravel in an instant. And there she sat, the embodiment of grace under fire, proving that true power doesn't need to shout. The waiter trembled, sweat glistening at his temples. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced with desperation. But Taylor remained unmoved, her stillness commanding more respect than any reprimand could have. The chandeliers glittered above her, casting light across her calm face. And in that silence, in that moment of shocking revelation, the entire room realized something undeniable. This wasn't just a celebrity sitting in a restaurant. This was Taylor Swift, the woman who owned the very floor they stood on, the walls that surrounded them, and the standards that truly mattered. And her silence was the most powerful response of all.
The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. The waiter's face had gone pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by sheer panic. His lips trembled as he tried to form words, his body stiff as though frozen in place. Finally, his voice cracked through the silence, weak and trembling. I'm so sorry, Miss Swift. I didn't know." But before he could finish, Taylor raised her hand slightly, her expression calm but firm. Her voice, when it came, carried a quiet strength that silenced the room more effectively than a shout ever could. "That's the point," she said, cutting gently through his stammering apology. The waiter blinked, confusion flashing in his eyes. Taylor's gaze was steady, her tone even, but each word landed with deliberate weight. "You didn't want to know. You judged me before you even asked my name.
before you even considered I might deserve the same respect you give anyone else who walks through these doors." The words reverberated through the restaurant like ripples in still water. Every diner felt them. Every guest seemed to shrink slightly, reflecting on their own moments of judgment, their own assumptions. Taylor leaned back in her chair, her hands folded gracefully in her lap. She didn't need to raise her voice. The calm authority in her tone was enough to command the attention of every soul in the room. "Remember this," she continued, her eyes never leaving the waiter. "Respect shouldn't depend on who someone is or how they look. It should be given freely, because every person who walks through that door deserves dignity." Silence stretched for a heartbeat, and then applause. It began softly, a single clap from the corner of the room, then another, louder this time. Within seconds, the entire restaurant erupted in applause. Diners nodded in agreement, their faces lit with admiration. Some stood, clapping louder, their voices carrying through the hall as if to echo her message. The chandeliers seemed to shimmer brighter as the sound of clapping filled the air. The pianist, who had long abandoned his keys, smiled and joined in, his hands striking together rhythmically with the crowd. The waiter's head lowered in shame. His shoulders sagged under the weight of his mistake, his earlier bravado completely gone. The applause wasn't for him. It was for her strength, her composure, her refusal to answer cruelty with cruelty. And yet, despite his humiliation, there was no cruelty in Taylor's eyes, only conviction, and perhaps a hint of compassion. She did not fire him on the spot. She did not demand punishment or revenge. Instead, she gave him something far more valuable: a lesson. Her silence had been powerful. Her words had been unforgettable. But her choice to offer grace, to allow him a second chance, was what made her truly extraordinary. The manager hovered nearby, still red-faced and nervous, waiting for instructions. But Taylor's calm demeanor made it clear. She didn't need to punish. The message was already crystal clear. The waiter, humbled and ashamed, whispered again, "I'm sorry." His voice broke on the last word. Taylor gave a faint nod, her voice soft this time, almost gentle. "Then prove it. Not to me. To every person you serve from this day forward." The applause swelled again, louder now, as if the diners themselves understood that they had just witnessed something rare, not just the humiliation of arrogance, but the redemption of humility. That night no one spoke of the meals they had ordered. No one recalled the taste of the wine or the elegance of the desserts. What they remembered was the story. The night when a young, arrogant waiter insulted Taylor Swift, not knowing she owned the very restaurant he worked in. The night when judgment turned into humiliation and arrogance was shattered by quiet dignity. The night when Taylor Swift, dressed simply, seated calmly, reminded an entire room that respect is not earned by appearances, but given as a basic human right. For the diners, it became a memory they would carry forever. They would retell it at dinner parties, whisper it at business meetings, and pass it along to friends as the night they witnessed greatness, not in music, but in character. For the waiter, it became a turning point. The lesson etched itself deep into his heart that arrogance costs more than it gives, and that a single moment of judgment can undo a lifetime of work. And for Taylor, it was another evening where her actions spoke louder than her fame. She didn't need to announce her wealth, her power, or her influence. She let her calm voice and unwavering grace be the lesson. The chandeliers glowed warmly above. The velvet seats creaked as diners rose to give her a standing ovation, and the applause carried long after she had placed her napkin neatly on the table. Her message lingered in the air, imprinted on every mind and every heart. Never judge a book by its cover. Respect costs nothing, but it could mean everything. And as the night drew to a close, everyone in the restaurant knew they had been part of something unforgettable. A story that would echo far beyond those golden walls. A lesson learned.